Thank you, Virgilia. So I'm Joyce Kimutai. I think I introduced myself in the morning, but it's also worth to mention that I am affiliated with University of Cape Town in South Africa. So under the African Climate and Development Institute, I'm also affiliated to the Kenya Meteorological Services in Kenya, and I was one of the lead authors for the special report on climate change and land for the IPCC. And today I'll be speaking about climate science for adaptation in least developed countries. Can I have... Thank you. Is it this? What? Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. So my talk today really is motivated by the fact that the current efforts to address climate change, there's only 20% of those efforts in terms of resources is dedicated to adaptation. And this really leaves the climate vulnerable societies or communities, like those in sub-Saharan Africa who depend on rain-fed agriculture, those who live in informal settlements with very little capacity to brace for the worst. And so in this talk, I'll talk about the least developed countries, and we'll focus on sub-Saharan Africa because more than 95% of these countries, or the vast population of these countries, live in sub-Saharan Africa. And in my effort to communicate the need for action, I will look at the current and the projected climate risks and threats in the region. I will also take you through the levels of vulnerability and exposure already existing in this region of the world. And I will talk about the regional tipping points, really, the irreversible damage that the region is likely to experience. And I'll have a few parting shots as recommendations. So just to start us off is on the current climate risk in Saharan Africa. Just for your information is that the rate of surface temperature increase is more rapid in Africa compared to the global average. That was a finding from the recent IPCC report. So Africa is a little bit higher than the global average, which is 1.09 to be precise. So most regions in Africa are already at their 1.5, 2 degrees. We see extreme events attributable to climate change already on the rise. We are seeing marine heat waves in the continent. We are seeing multi-year droughts in West and East Africa. Just for your information, is there's this very prolonged drought in East Africa at the moment. It's sent more than 18 million people on acute food insecurity. And we're also seeing floods in Southern Africa. Just 3 months ago, there was quite a devastating flood in KZN, so the eastern part of South Africa. So these are really the risks and the current threats we are seeing in the continent at the moment. We are also seeing a lot of losses and damages that are attributed to climate change. We're seeing approximately 337 million people being affected by natural disasters between 2000 and 2019. Floods is accounting for 80% of that. We're seeing droughts at 16%. We also see approximately 6 million people displaced by weather and related disasters between 2018 to 2019. That's a very short time, and this is staggering statistics to show. And whooping 46,000 deaths from weather-related disasters between 2000 and 2019. We're also seeing the largest number of mortalities from floods. As in, if you compare with the global statistics, the largest number of mortalities associated with floods since 1990 is from sub-Saharan Africa. And when we look at the projected risks, sorry that you can't see the burning amber. So that is the African burning embers. I wish I could bring that more closely for you to have a look. But basically what that embers is trying to explain is the risks. So these are the most sectors that are experiencing the highest risk at the moment. So these are the key sectors. And if we're looking at biodiversity, we're looking at risk associated with food loss, reduced productivity from land. And we see that in scenarios with low adaptation, there's actually widespread impact already happening on biodiversity at the current warming level. And also to say is that when adaptation is not implemented to address, when adaptation is only implemented to address the impacts of climate change, rather than including also the drivers of what make people vulnerable to these impacts of the climate change, then these efforts really become a bit ineffective. So here I want to really highlight the levels of vulnerability and exposure. And we see that most people actually in sub-Saharan Africa are employed in climate-exposed sectors. So we see 55 to 62% of the workforce employed in agriculture. 95% of cropland is rain-fed. So you can imagine what that really means for the people. We see 66% of the urban workforce living in formal employment, work on informal employment. At the moment, we see rapid urbanization, growing informal settlements, and around 60% of the urban dwellers in Africa at the moment living in formal settlements. Yeah, so you can imagine the level of vulnerability and exposure that exists in the continent. And also we see that there's reduced growth, so reduced productivity. So we see that temperature impacts on GDP is also rampant. We see this in countries like Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe and Kenya. We also see droughts, agricultural drought. There's an example of a city in South Africa that it lost about 80% of the businesses, and more than 50% of the employees were actually laid off as a result of agricultural drought that prevailed. And we're also seeing reduction in hydropower generation from reduced river flows in parts of East Africa. And I would also really want to highlight today on tipping points in Africa. This is a question for us to say when, where are they? Are they reached? Do they exist already? So when we look at glaciers in Mount Kenya and Mount Rwenzori, it's projected to disappear by 2030. And when you actually visit Mount Kenya at the moment, you will see quite substantive reduction in glaciers. And we think it's really a reality that this might disappear by 2030. And for Mount Kilimanjaro, it's projected to disappear by 2040. We also see intense tropical cyclones. So there's a possibility of intense tropical cyclones. So before we didn't have category 4 tropical cyclones in East Africa, but in 2019, there was a category 4, 5 tropical cyclone that went far into Maputo, that is really deep far into the interior of the continent. We're also seeing a possibility of it going as far as Richards Bay in South Africa and in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And we are looking at local extinction of species. So this is really, there's a possibility of extirpation of most foreseeable climate risk. This is a most foreseeable climate risk in the near term. So we are seeing local extinction of species. There was a paper that was just released the other day that was actually looking at possibility of species being extirpated by at least at 1.5. Which will, according to us, will really happen in the most near future. And then we also see intense and frequent multi-year droughts and heat waves severely impacting maize crops and livestock. This for sure is already happening. But we need to ask, is there a point of collapse to this? And we're seeing intense and frequent heat waves impacting on health and mortality. This is also a possibility. This is also tipping points that we see happening in this part of the world. And then there's also possibilities of day zero drought in rapidly growing cities. You guys are aware of what happened in Cape Town in 2017, 2018. We missed day zero by a whisker, and we see this as a risk that is quite foreseeable in a very near term. And just on my recommendations, I want to highlight really to say that adaptation should be a central theme in climate policy actions, especially in the most vulnerable parts of the globe. And this should be locally led processes and interventions. So what I'm trying to say is we need African solutions for African problems. So it has to be very locally led processes, location specific, context specific. And just to highlight is that we only have 3.8% of the global climate change research is being spent in Africa. This is so serious. And from the plots you see there is on adaptation research. There's very little done in Africa at the moment. We really need, the continent really needs support on this. More needs to be done in terms of research, the amount of money that is being spent on research. And you also find that most of the research that is being done is not led by the authors that are based in the countries, in these countries. So you find that it's mostly northern, global north-based authors. And we really want to have more of an African focused research and work to be done in the continent. And just as I finish up is I want to say that I want us to ask ourselves these questions. Are we doing science in a vacuum? What's ethical and what's fair? How different would it be if scientific results were interpreted as people really mattered? So what I need to say here is, what I'm really trying to say here is that science needs to be done holistically and implemented with compassion and empathy. Thanks.